Got it. Good. So can we start? I'll start with the general introduction, and that has to do with basically looking at a number of functions of the voice, human vocalizations, in different kinds of social pursuits. So competition, rivalry, obviously, mating rituals, social bonding, ownership territory, food resources, predator alarm, meta-communication, and specifically emotions. But before we get to the emotions, we'll talk a bit about competition, rivalry, social bonding, ownership territory, because in at least many animal societies, that is a very important issue for vocalization. By the way, I will show in some cases slides with a lot of text, and I will speak only very briefly about it. So it is your task to very quickly scan to see whether you find anything that you would like to talk about more later. But I'm afraid it would be impossible to go through in detail each time. So it's there for your information, but I'll try to summarize each time what exactly I want to get across. Okay, now the issue of vocal affect universals is very important. So there are a number of affective motivational states of the sender: relaxation, contentment, comfort, play, dominance, hostility, agonistic intention, defense, fear, submission, resignation. And there are a number of acoustic characteristics that have been revealed in the literature. So, for example, repeated short sounds with relatively low frequencies for relaxation. For dominance, very important, low frequency sounds, quite a lot of harshness and falling frequency. I won't go through everything, as I said, because we really want to mostly deal with dominance and submission for the moment. And submission, resignation is high frequency, tone-like sounds with repeated frequency shifts. That's what sort of the literature says. And what we will do is also look at the extent to which we can empirically demonstrate these things. I don't know. Okay. So here is one interesting study that was done by Cheney and Seyfarth on alarm calls to show that these animals, the vervet monkeys, actually use different sounds to inform their conspecifics about specific types of predators. So, for example, this is a leopard. Can you hear me? Okay. An eagle. And a snake. Okay, so they have these different sounds to not only produce an alarm, but also to already indicate what the kind of possible predator is. So it's really quite a sophisticated system already in this very early form of mammal communication. Okay, one of the things that really links us to the animal world is affect bursts. Sudden, full-blown displays of emotion in response to highly effectively charged and often unexpected events, like the predator calls, for example. And these are eruptive outbursts of emotion, automatically produced. We call them in psychology push effects. That produce brief, consistent changes in facial, vocal, and possibly gestural and postural expression. So as you can see, this is a nice example for such a very strong fear burst. And the fundamental hypothesis is, and that's why I start with the animals, is that affect bursts were really at the origin of the co-evolution of speech and music. And so it is very interesting to draw the parallels. But before we go any further, to show you some examples. So here you have a nice example for an animal, I would say aggression, a dominant behavior. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay, so humans can do that quite as well.
One person's hands, not the American way. These damn bills that come out here all the damn time, come out here at the last second, and I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people. I'm sick of it. Every year, we give power to one person. Now we pass rules that stop it.
So you already get some information about how the voice changes, and this kind of aggressive behavior. Question is he really dominant? Because to some extent, his pitch clearly is very high. And so the question is to what extent this is not a much more complicated case that one could look into. Here is another one, another type of anger.
No mistakes whatsoever.
Second stop, please.
Answer my question! The question, jerk!
Okay. You can see this was in part an affect burst. And also one thing that becomes very clear is that loudness is a very important aspect, as we shall see. Here you have just also to have some female dominance.
Alors laissez de côté vos tribunaux, les démarches des parents qui en ont assez déjà de leur souffrance et d'avoir vu leurs enfants ne pas pouvoir être inscrits lors des rentrées scolaires pendant lesquelles vous étiez au gouvernement. Laissez cela de côté, parce que la façon là dont vous venez faire de l'immoralité politique par rapport à une politique qui a été détruite et à laquelle je tenais particulièrement, parce que je sais à quel point cela soulageait les parents de voir leurs enfants accueillis à l'école. Et c'est vous qui avez cassé cette politique-là. Et aujourd'hui, vous venez de promettre comme ça.
Okay. You get the difference, I think, to some extent, in which the kind of rhetoric that is being used will also be determined by the occasion, of course, and so the voice will follow accordingly. So here is the central role of power in vocal communication. So I would define it as the degree of action potential in terms of being able to do something for influencing outcomes by acting on another person's behavior and situational determinants. And that, of course, is very important in social life when things don't always go the way that we want them to go. And so to some extent, it depends on whether you can hold your own or not. And so the types of power are clearly size, force, and attraction, mastery, available resources, and authority, rank, and position. So you have partly a dispositional aspect, which is stable over time. So if you're the boss, you have power because of authority, and it's over time. Dispositional or situational, where in some situations, maybe because you know better, you are the one who has more power because of your expertise. Right. Here are some of the voice signaling sender characteristics. So to some extent, you have age, sex, size that are being communicated by your voice. You have social status, which often is communicated. Dispositions like personality, as we shall see, very important. Affective disturbances. Then there is states, momentary states, health, affect, emotion. We'll devote the second part of the talk to this, and intentions, so rhetorical, persuasive. So you see, it's already a rather complicated intermix between different factors, different determinants that have an influence on the voice. So the complexity is really quite high in terms of what will be able to change the vocal production. So for example, just one example, physical power. Here is a nice example on different roars of beer that has been studied by Fitch in particular, where you have larynx lowering in situations of powerful displays. And that is very often affecting the harmonic structure of the sound in terms of, because of the lowering of the formants, as you can see here, it changes the formant distance. So a harsh roar, the B, for example, this one here is a harsh roar that shows noisy glottal waves and well-defined non-modulated formant frequencies in terms of these. So we don't want to go into detail, but you can see to what extent there are a number of acoustic parameters that respond directly to this kind of posturing of power. The same for baboons. Baboon loud calls advertise male quality. An interesting study by Julia Fisher, still working on this, and Seyfarth and Cheney, that provide acoustic indicators of rank, age, and exhaustion. In some sense, very similar as before, it has to do very often with the spectral characteristics of the voice, but also loudness, of course, and other features. I don't want to go into all these different aspects here. But just one more example in terms of men's voices, the human case, vocal fundamental frequency influence dominance attributions. So we know that it's not only the fact that if you're a very dominant person, you may speak differently, but also that even if you're not, but if you speak that way, you will be perceived as dominant, and that can have a very strong impact on you. I was always fascinated by the fact that Margaret Thatcher took voice lessons because she had been told that she was very ineffective because her voice was too high and her pitch was changing too much. And so she had some voice coaching, and the result is here. I don't want to go into detail, but she was very happy with the results. In fact, the pitch change reduced, but the pitch stayed fairly high. Certainly she was considered as more adequate in terms of, the powerful position of Prime Minister. Okay, Felix Burkhardt already talked to you about my origin, and this is one of the first studies I did at Harvard and MIT with also Jerry Wolf, who was a voice person at MIT, where we looked at what happens when you want to basically communicate confidence, and you have a confident text and you have a doubtful text. So we manipulated the nature of the text that the speakers had to provide, and then also to what extent they felt confident or doubtful about something. And the important thing here is to show the importance of this interaction. So if you have a doubtful text, you really have to put more into the confident voice. In this case, to some extent, the energy being much higher than if you have a doubtful text, okay? And also F0, much higher. So you really basically compensate the doubt in the text by producing a more confident, powerful voice. This is Brunswickian model. Brunswick is a perception psychologist, was a perception psychologist who produced the so-called lens model. So this is basically my thesis at the time, published quite a while afterwards, but the idea was that I thought dominance would then lead to changes in voice quality that would be perceived differently, and which would lead to certain attributions of personality. What happened was that dominance didn't do much. Maybe it was the measurement of dominance, but extroversion did. So if you're extroverted, you speak more strongly, more loudly, you have more pitch height, higher pitch, that is perceived as a loud voice and not a gloomy voice. A gloomy voice is very bad in terms of English American habits. And these things were then indeed perceived as extroversion. So we could show that it was possible, because of these voice characteristics, to correctly, basically more correctly than you would expect by chance, predict the personality of the person. These were jurors, basically mock jury trials, and perceived influence we studied separately. And here you have some of the effects of dominance. This is the dominance trait now that we measured in the speakers. And so they had more, in particular, they had a higher pitch range, as you can see, and fewer silent pauses. Those were very important. And these were also highly predictive of perceived influence. So again, showing that personality changes vocal behavior, and which is perceived in terms of social relevance issues, such as perceived influence on the jury decision afterwards. Okay, so much for early research. This is research I did with Tom Johnson, Karen van Rekom, where we used a computer game where we were able to manipulate power and the conduciveness of the action of the player. So they had to shoot down a certain number of things, and they could be shot down. And so we manipulated power, for example, by the number of bullets that they could shoot at these enemies. Also low and high control, to what extent they hit or did not hit, precision. So power was the rate of the bullets, control was the wobbly kind of case. And then reaching the next level, conducive or obstructive. And so we could show that power, again, you have low power here, where the voice didn't make that much difference, but high power, clearly, in terms of the median F0, when you have high power and you're in an obstructive situation, you increase the pitch of your voice. So in this experimental study, very clearly shown. So it is already quite a bit different from what I showed you at the beginning in terms of what's always been held about the dominant voice always being low in pitch, not necessarily. So in some cases, as here, pitch itself also goes up and loudness goes up. Okay, so much on the power part. I don't know whether we should discuss that or whether we should wait till the end. Maybe it'd be easier to go to the end so we know how much time we have. So passion, emotion. I would first like to give you the fundamental theoretical basis for this, because in order to try to understand how this works, we need to know something about the emotions. So here is an event that happens. You see your shares go down. So it's very relevant for you, all kinds of motivational, cognitive factors that are being involved. You say, this is really important for me. It's novel, I didn't expect it. This will affect my goals because I will lose money, but I can cope. I have more money to invest, so I can deal with this. And then also in terms of the normative significance, did I do the right thing? Or did the other people do the right thing? No, because it may be immoral that it goes down. Okay, so what this allows you to do is now to make predictions on how these appraisals, as we call them, that produce the emotion, how the different appraisals change the voice. So the idea, just to give you one example, is if you have something very pleasant, you have a focal and pharyngeal expansion, relaxation of the vocal tract walls, vocal tract shortened because of the facial expression. And that I would call is a wide voice. increase in low frequency energy, F1 is falling, slightly broader F1 bandwidth, velopharyngeal nasality, resonance is raised, etc. So let's take dominance again, maybe power down here. So the idea is that you usually vocalize in chest register phonation rather than head register phonation. The full voice, generally low F0, although as I already showed you, that's not always the case. High amplitude, strong energy in the entire frequency range. So the excuse me. The advantage is that you can really have very detailed hypotheses about how these appraisals that determine what emotion you feel should act on the voice. So for example, you can now predict for a number of emotions like these: stress, anger, rage, fear, panic, sadness, how different vocal features should move. Okay, the hypotheses. We did a few studies using actors to basically test these hypotheses. So for example, you have one. Very low. Okay, you get an idea. And so we used two nonsense syllable sentences. And then we did the analysis. So the arousal activation dimension of the emotions is very much linked to fundamental frequency. So here you see low arousal and high arousal going from contentment, boredom, happiness, etc., to elation, hot anger, etc. So it's a whole continuum of arousal. And you get a virtually linear increase in F0. So here we get the first idea of why sometimes, contrary to what we would expect, there is high pitch in powerful voices, because there is often, in the examples I showed at the beginning, very high arousal. So you have high arousal and you have a high amplitude. You have a high F0. But you also have the full voice. So the loudness is there, as predicted, but is linked to the arousal in terms of F0. Here you have energy distribution of the spectrum. And what you can see is that the high dominance emotions like hot anger and also to some extent elation, but also despair, are really very different from some of the others, where, so for example, the percentage of energy above 500 or 1,000 are really much lower than in some of the other kinds of cases. Here we have the tense lex voice dimension that I showed you before in the predictions, tense and lex. Reflected here in terms of the spectral energy, and you can see to what extent tense is linked also linearly to this dimension. That's the second study, also with actors. This time we also looked at video, more in more detail, better quality. And we basically varied the emotions in terms of arousal and valence. And here you have some of the results. These are at 0. And again, you can see that, for example, for anger, fairly high, for joy, also very high, and fear, very high. That's the arousal part. So because of the arousal, you have the F0 very high, even in high dominance emotions like anger. Here you have intensity measures, and as predicted, you have a very high value for anger, lower for fear, and lower for joy, but still higher in these cases than in cases of, for example, interest or pleasantness that are much more moderate kinds of effects. Perturbation, I don't want to get into now. Here is a study that we did on the same material, but looking at R's, just R's, the R vocalizations, and also looking at a number of source characteristics. This was with Feinberg, who of course is Mr. Voice in phonetics. And we looked at a large number of different source characteristics using inverse filtering at the time. And out of these, there are a number of things that are more important. Here you can see the variables, and this is the effect they have on 3 central dimensions that I don't want to get into. So we had 12 predictors, and you get 87% accuracy in predicting the location of the emotion. But what is important is that the mean F0 and the HNR index are really among the most important ones. And if you have only these, then basically you are in good shape, because you already get 78% of the variance. So that means that there is a lot of overlap between different vocal parameters, and we find that in quite a few studies, that you basically don't need all these variables because they correlate fairly highly, and so some of the central ones may be sufficient. Now, one of the things I'd like to discuss also with Felix afterwards is that, of course, in machine learning experiments, you basically have the opposite. You really multiply the number of variables you have to get good prediction. And then I think is something that will need to be discussed, that also has to do with, you know, the success of predictions and so on. But we'll discuss this further in the discussion. Here we have just the predictions and the patterns. I don't want to go into it, just to tell you that many of these are according to prediction before. And this is mapping the same thing into space, but we don't want to go further on that. One final aspect I'd like to get into, and that is the issue of prototype recognition. That's usually what you do in machine learning. You try to identify one state, anger, that's it. Another model is that you try to do it on the basis of these appraisals that I told you are the essential predictors of what emotion will come out. And so you would say that very novel, something that is not very pleasant, I don't really have much control power, but it's urgent. And you would say stupefaction. That's not a basic emotion, right? So this means that if you do your analysis on the basis of this fine-grained method, you may get a more precise indication of what the emotion is than when you choose 1 out of 9 or 12 or whatever basic emotions. So it is really more in line with the way that voice quality is determined in emotion processes, that it is determined by these factors. And what you call it afterwards is really a side product, if you will. And in fact, there is a big debate now for some time in emotion psychology about these basic emotion theories that claim you have basically 8 emotions and that's it. And we try to discover those or detect those. So these different appraisals over time affect various things like the physiology, motivation, execution. And physiology in particular, of course, is very important for the voice, and motivation is to some extent, and then that comes out in the vocal expression. Basically, same thing that we had before. So for the face, we have already shown that this works. If you do it in the face, and you base the inference on the action units in the face that are predicted by the theory, you get a very good result. There is a nice study by Petri Lauka and Hilary Anger-Elfenbein who do show that emotion appraisal dimensions can be inferred from vocal expressions. So people, listeners, will be able to infer these appraisals from the voice, which again indicates that the information is there. I don't want to go into this, but it shows you that, again, intensity, but also harmonic, so spectral issues are very important for power in particular. Okay, again, here we don't want to go into the details, but dominance, power, F0 semitone, very important. Loudness, percentile, very important. So that's basically what I've been talking all along. That these are central indicators of voice. So with Deering, we did a study that was financed by the European Research Council, basically a proof of concept grant based on an advanced grant that I had from them, advocating this model also for automatic detection. And Deering did ask for a patent, and the latest I've heard, Felix, maybe you know more, is that at least the American application seems to be in a good way, but everything takes very long in that respect. So the idea is to do the same thing, that you basically measure the appraisals in the voice, and then on that basis, you decide on what it is out of a much larger list of things. Okay, and that would be the idea of the whole thing. Now, I had planned, but I will not, to talk a little bit about depression and clinical incidences, but we're already at almost 40, so I will not go into this. It's just that the voice is very important for detecting changes that are linked to depression. And what we have argued is that there ought to be much more emphasis on this, using efficient diagnostic instruments to better understand emotional disturbance and personality disorders, much more than you currently find, where psychiatrists basically have very, I don't want to say primitive, but very limited measuring instruments, often only self-report. And if you were to use voice analysis and some other indicators, that would give us a much more sophisticated insight into the nature of the disease and also for improvements. We're currently involved in, and Felix may talk more about that, or has already talked to you about that, I don't know, in European Horizon 2020 study called EchoWeb, assessing and enhancing emotional competence of well-being in the young, principled, evidence-based, mobile health approach to prevent mental disorders and promote mental well-being. And we're right in the middle of testing, unfortunately, very belatedly, part of the app that is to do some of that, is to get the people in the study to report on their emotional experiences by speaking into the phone, and to then have that analyzed and to then try to get a better basis in terms of data for doing that kind of diagnostics. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to get across, maybe a bit fast, but we have some time now to pick up on different issues.